Hey, what's up? Welcome back. Thank you again so much for joining us as we build out this newsletter platform using Stripe Connect. We're using Ruby and Rails and Tailwind UI. It is a great time. And we're at the point where we need to create a webhook handler that works for Stripe connected account events. In a previous episode, we set up a generic webhook handler. We're going to look at that today, but we're also going to talk about handling the account updated events because we're starting the onboarding flow for connected accounts. This is every time an author wants to get paid for newsletters that they're sending out, they need a connected account. In order to get a connected account that is a proper Stripe account, we're going to use this Stripe hosted surface here for users to enter in all of their personal information and their business information, their payment details, so that they can receive payment for the newsletters that they're sending, and so they can monetize that. As part of this onboarding flow, we want to listen for an account.updated webhook event to come through. Now there's two different kinds of webhooks. So if we go into our Stripe dashboard and we go to the developers tab and to webhooks, we can create a brand new webhook here by saying add an endpoint. Now you'll notice that when you're filling out this form, there are two different events that you can listen to, or two different groups of events that you can listen to, events that are on your own account. So this would be the platform events that are happening. And we do care about those, but we can also create a second webhook. So we're gonna have two different webhook endpoints. One is for events happening on our platform. The other is for events happening on connected accounts. Now, the ones that we care about in this case are the events that are happening on the connected accounts. Now let me show you, if we jump over to Connect, the Connect tab here, and scroll down, these are the two accounts that we just created as part of our test onboarding flow. This was an account that I created just as I was experimenting. I want to show you how you can figure out which events are happening on the connected accounts. So from this account detail view, I can go up to the right-hand side and say, I want to view the dashboard as this account. So now we're kind of looking at this author's Stripe dashboard. So we can go to the developers tab and to events, and you'll see all of the events that are happening on their specific account. At the very bottom, you'll notice that your account information was updated. So this is the account.updated event. That is going to fire on their account. And this is the payload that came as part of the webhook. So this is the data that we care about, right? We want to check and see if charges are enabled, if details are submitted, and if transfers are enabled, payouts enabled. So it's actually payouts enabled, not transfers enabled. I named it transfers enabled in the database, but whatever. Okay, so that means that we want a connect webhook endpoint. We're going to use the Stripe CLI to make a direct connection between Stripe and our local running server so that we don't need to deploy this code to any public servers, and we don't need to use tools like ngrok. So it's quite simple. We can say Stripe login. That's the first step. We want to make sure that we are authenticated with the right Stripe account. So we say Stripe login. This is the newsletter platform. We can say allow access, and access is granted. Now what we can do is say Stripe listen --to localhost 3000 /webhooks /Stripe. Now, if we look at our routes, recall that we have this endpoint webhooks /:source. So this will create a new Stripe source for events that are coming in. The first argument where we're passing as forward to, this is the webhook endpoint that we want to use for account related events. This is just for our account. The second one here, forward connect to, these are for the connected accounts events. So here we can say, if we say enter, this is going to fire up a brand new listener. And as events happen on our Stripe account or on our connected accounts, they will be forwarded directly to these webhook endpoints. So let's experiment just for a second. We'll say Stripe trigger charge.created, or let's do Stripe trigger customer.created. That should create a customer object on our platform and deliver it to our endpoint. So here we see the customer created event fired, and that event was posted as a post request to webhooks /Stripe. So if we look in the server logs here, you'll notice that we received this post request to webhooks /Stripe. That came from Stripe, and using the Stripe CLI, we forwarded that to our local running machine. And our local running machine The webhook handler created and stored a new event object in the database with all of the JSON from the payload, and then it scheduled a background job here called an event job to go process that event in the background. If you're curious about how to set up the background job or the webhook handler, go back and take a look at some of those earlier episodes. But now we have this event object that we see it was handling the Stripe event, but now we need to actually go and pull off these event objects and start processing them. So what we can do is head over to our event job and handle the Stripe event. So there's a couple things we want to do. First of all, we want to parse that JSON into a proper event object. So we can actually just maybe call this the raw event. And we want to say the event is actually going to be stripe.event.construct from raw event.data. And I think we might need to also like JSON parse this thing. And that should give us an event that we can start working with. Then we can use a case statement to switch on the event type. And we can say if the event type is account.updated, then we know this is an account.updated event and we want to handle the account updated event. So here we can say, all right, when we get an account updated event, we want to look at the payload and check to see if the account has its charges enabled or payouts enabled and details submitted. So here what we want to do is we need to find the account in the database by the ID in the payload. Then we need to update the account with the new data. Okay, so first we're going to say account is account.find by Stripe account ID. And that should be something like event.data.object.id. This should also be on, I believe it's event.account. And then we can say something like count.update charges enabled are going to be event.data.object.charges enabled. Transfers enabled is going to be payouts enabled. So many years ago, transfers used to be called payouts or payouts used to be called transfers. They combined the concept, but so that it's a little bit more clear, a transfer is when money is being sent from one Stripe account to another Stripe account. And a payout is when money is being sent from a Stripe account to some third party, like external account. So that's like into your bank account. Okay. And then finally, details submitted is going to be event.data.object.details submitted. Now I'm going to leave this as is, and we're going to go through the onboarding process here, and we should receive that event at the very end. So as you're going through in test mode, we can use the test phone number here and say continue. And because we use the test phone number, we want to use the test code and continue. Now there are several magic strings that you can use as you're filling this out. We're going to use Jenny Rosen. Now the date of birth, if you use 01/01/1901, that is a valid date of birth. There is a document here called Connect Testing, which has a bunch of identity verification details. So if you use this date of birth, then it will come back with a successful verification. And you can see a couple different others that will trigger different requirements or different states for the account. Now, when we're talking about the address, we want to use address_full_match for successful verification. So again, we're going to come back here, and our address is going to be address full match. And then we do need a valid city and state. I don't know if the zip needs to be valid. And for the phone number, we'll just use the same phone number, and then the last 4 is all zeros. When we're ready to select where we want payouts, we can use a test bank account here, and we should be good to go. Now, when we click agree and submit, I expect to receive these account.updated events. So it looks like we were already receiving many of those, but we're getting a 500 error. So let's go look in the server logs and see why we're receiving a 500 error here. Okay, we're missing a closing paren or comma or something. So, oh, yep, missing a comma there. Okay, so let's see if that fixed things. All right, so we're going to say agree and submit. All right, now we're getting 200s back, and we did get a connect account.updated event that fired. Let's look in the server logs again. It looks like we are receiving those events. let's open up Rails console here and take a look at account.last. Okay, so it looks like charges enabled, transfers are enabled is still false. So let's do count.first. Okay, look at that. Charges are enabled, transfers are enabled, details were submitted. If we go to /accounts, now we have an account that is active and it has charges enabled, transfers enabled, and onboarding is complete. So what I think we might want to do is also add the concept of a default account where we can mark this as default. The only other thing that I wanted to do was look at these events that are coming in. You'll notice that the status is still pending on all of these events, and we haven't really handled any processing errors. So inside of my event job here, what I want to do is add a rescue at the very bottom that will say if while we're attempting to handle the event, if it fails, we want to update the processing errors, and we also want to set the status to failed. And before we start any of the processing, we want to update the event and set its status to processing, right? Because if we look at the event model again, we have pending, processing, processed, and failed. So we're going to update to processing, and it's going to start working through any of the event handling. And if there's an exception, then we're going to update it to failed, store the processing error so we know why it failed. And then if it succeeds, then here we want to update to processed, and then we'll be done and we can move on with that event. And we know that we don't need to reprocess it. This is handy because it allows you to build in some like retries on your side without depending on the data being inside of Stripe. So let's refresh this and we can say like event.last. Okay, so right now it's set as pending. Let's see what the event type was again. So the type in this case was capability to update it. So we actually don't care about 22. Maybe let's say like event.find21.data. That's also capability.updated. Let's try 20. And that one is account.updated. So event 20 is the one that we care about running right now. So event job.perform now for event.find20 event job. Okay. And then we can see if event.find20, now it shows processed. So now at least we're like handling the status or some basic life cycle and state of our events as they're going through and being processed. And we're handling our account.updated event, and that is updating our database. And so once we have an account that has charges enabled, now we can start to actually like send money to this account when we receive payments from end customers. So let's also add the concept of default. So let's do that. So we're going to say Rails G migration, add default to accounts, or like, yeah, default, we'll call it default account to accounts. We only want one default account per author so that we can route payments accordingly. But in the future, you might want to get fancy and say, okay, for this newsletter, I want the payments to go to this Stripe account. For this other newsletter, I want to go to this other Stripe account. So in the case where we want to actually have multiple Stripe accounts, this will be nice to expand to in the future. But by default, we'll just say it's going to default to true. And then anytime it changes, it should update all the others to false. But for now, we'll just say that, yeah, they're all going to be true. And then we'll just have to manually update Rails C. We'll say account.last .update default count is false. Okay. Now we can go into the user and say def default count, and we'll say accounts.find by default is true. Okay. Now we should have a default account for each user that we can use when we're sending along payments. All right. So in the next step here, we've kind of gone through the whole onboarding process. So we have our webhook coming in. We have a way to add and create an account. We can go through that whole onboarding flow. If you look in the dashboard now, we should have we should have an account. So if we go to connect, we have this most recent account. Yeah, so we have a complete account. That is great. We have this complete account. Now what we want to do is start actually sending money to this account when they receive payments from end customers. So let's talk next about subscribing to a newsletter and then sending them payment. I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's do that next. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.